This is not my first video about intentional camera movement, but what makes this one different is the idea of shooting motion upon motion. It's not just my camera that is moving for this tutorial on ICM, but the subject itself is moving too. What happens when you apply slow shutters and ICM techniques to the movement of a Bhutanese prayer wheel? Let's dig in. A few weeks back, I did a much longer video to walk you through my version of intentional camera movement, ICM, and how I connected with the Himalayas through that process. Today, however, I'm going to focus on prayer wheels and a few sets of images captured during my visit to Bumthang in Bhutan. I'm often drawn to prayer wheels. Even in my very first trip to Bhutan over a decade ago, I was using slow exposures back then to pull the motion from these wheels. The combination of movement and colour is always a little bit special. For me, the process of intentional camera movement is about settling into the moment. It's not about chasing an image, but letting yourself go deeper into a connection with that place. Ironically, time itself seems to disappear when shooting these slow shutters. I don't like to rush the process. I find a source of colour and texture and I let myself go deeper into it. ICM works really well in this context. Often I've seen prayer wheels as a chance to shoot conventional static scene, but with the twist of using a slow shutter to reveal the movement of a single wheel, so that most of the scene is static, but one wheel is turning. I've done this a lot in the Himalayas, but this winter I've been stepping sideways into proper intentional camera movement and combining the movement of prayer wheels with fundamental ICM techniques, and that's been a real joy for me. What happens when you spin and drift your camera across a 2-second exposure while the giant prayer wheel is spinning in a similar direction? Lots and lots and lots of lovely, slightly unexpected things is what happens. In some ways, this process reminds me of spirographs and creating overlapping sets of mathematical patterns. But this time I'm working freeform in an environment where some of the maths gets a little wobbly. At least in my hands, it gets kind of wobbly. I tend to think of ICM as painting with light, but when you've got the added texture created by richly detailed prayer wheels, I think we're at the point of weaving with light. I'm literally trying to weave together scenes based on threads of light coming from the location and coming through the camera. Deep inside these ICM captures, there exists a connection between the photographer and the subject, the threads of light that connect me with the prayer wheel. There's a story woven into every single frame. That's what makes it special. That's why I can't just grab a quick snap when I'm working on intentional camera movement. It takes time and it takes intent. That's what the I in ICM stands for. When I walk through the images that I've been collecting in Bhutan, I'm reflecting on how much of my affection for an image is clouded by my connection with the subject. That is to say, is it a good image or am I being sentimental? When I look through these images of the prayer wheels in Jakar Dzong, for me, there's a lot of connection and a lot of meaning behind each of the images. There's a hint of Tibetan script that's outlined in gold. There's deep lines of colour up and down the wheel, the tone of the yellow walls in the background even. Each time these elements come through in an image, it triggers a little something in my brain. I have a sentimental connection. My philosophy for photography is precisely based on that. Let those connections come through as strongly as possible. Let them guide how you capture an image. I emphasize the connection between the photographer and the subject. But, and it's a big one, when you're curating images to share with the world, that same sentimental influence can cloud your judgment. If I am guided by attachment to every image that evokes a connection to the subject, then I end up wanting to include every photo that I've shot. That's no longer curating, that's just hoarding. I need to remember that the audience won't know this location the way I do. They haven't stood in that zong, they haven't walked up those stairs, they didn't hear the monks chanting in the background, and they didn't spend half an hour shooting a single prayer wheel the way I did. They are looking at a photo. Their experience is simply not the same as mine. I want to use my images to bring them into my world, but they will have their own experience with that photo, just as I had my own experience with that zong. When curating images, I need to be less cloudy and more detached. Buddhism itself teaches us about detachment. So prayer wheels in a Bhutanese zong really is the perfect place to reflect on curation. The thing about detachment that often gets overlooked, however, is that detachment must always be balanced with compassion. Detachment means letting go of ownership, while compassion means retaining your connection to others. Curating a set of images requires an element of detachment from the original moment of capture. I want more than just sentimentality here. I'm trying to collate a set of images that speak together and has some impact, that express something greater than any single image could express on its own. I am sharing that subject as best as I can. I care about the subject. That's why I'm sharing it. I care about my audience. That's why I want them to see it. And that's where the element of compassion comes back into the overall equation. Detachment is where I stop getting too sentimental about every single image, and I look at each one with fresh eyes. Which images best evoke the essence of a subject? Are there any frames in the set which double up in what they contain and hence can be taken out? Which captures are most expressive in the particular way that I am striving for with intentional camera movement? My style for this series has been minimal contrast and looking for the balance where I retain barely a hint of detail, but are strong on possessing a sense of flow using layers of colours. That's a really big statement, I know. Layers of colours, flow and minimal detail. I'm not looking for sharpness and clarity, so I don't want to include any images that are too defined or too contrasty or too divergent from the overall style. I want consistency across the series, yet diversity within the content that I'm presenting. The reason I wanted to make a second video about intentional camera movement was because my experience at Jacquard Zong was really wonderful. And for me, it introduced an entirely new element into my creative process that I just hadn't dialed into when I made the first video. Intentional camera movement is a process, not a destination. The deeper you go into your process, the more rewarding intentional camera movement becomes. Having a giant wheel of color and textures that spin around in front of me and my camera is a stunning treat. An entirely reproducible pattern of movement that I can throw different camera movements at is a great way to experiment with ICM and a great way to immerse yourself in the creative process. I hope you enjoyed this little sojourn into the world of Bhutanese prayer wheels. Please show some love by hitting the like button, and if you're new to my channel, I'd love to have you subscribe, and maybe my next video will pop into your feed somewhere down the track. Have a great day.